Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There are texts that inform, texts that entertain, and texts that warn. But there exists a category even more troubling: texts that are not meant to be read, but merely known about from a distance, cautiously, and never completely. The Necronomicon, often whispered as the Book of the Dead, or Al-Azif in its original Arabic, occupies precisely this category. It is not a manual of magic in the traditional sense. It is not a fictional device to be dismissed with the turning of a final page. It is, instead, a kind of literary contagion, spreading not through belief or ritual, but through the act of recognition itself. We must recognize, from the outset, that the Necronomicon is a product of invention, and yet its effects behave with the persistence of truth. First conceived by H.P. Lovecraft as a fictional grimoire within his growing mythos, the book quickly escaped the boundaries of its narrative world. Scholars have debated its structure, occultists have claimed to find its pages, and cultural theorists have treated it as a prism through which to view humanity's enduring fear of knowledge that deforms the knower. In this investigation, we will not ask whether the Necronomicon is real. That question is both too simple and too dangerous. Instead, we will ask what it means, as symbol, as warning, as literary phenomenon, and as an idea that continues to echo across disciplines. Its presence in fiction is undeniable, but its grip on reality, however imagined, is what truly deserves our attention. Abdul al-Hazred is introduced in scattered references, footnotes, and whispered asides within H.P. Lovecraft's corpus, yet he stands at the center of one of modern literature's most enduring mythic texts. According to Lovecraft's fabricated chronicle, al-Hazred was born in Sana'a, Yemen, during the early 8th century, a period in which Islamic scholarship flourished under the Abbasid Caliphate, and long-forgotten pagan rites still lingered at the edges of the Arabian deserts. This supposed setting, half real, half invented, allowed Lovecraft to anchor his mad Arab in a recognizable but obscure cultural frame, making him plausible enough for readers to accept as an authentic historical occultist. We must recognize here that Lovecraft's choice of Yemen and the Rub al-Khali was not merely ornamental, but strategic, since these were regions that Western audiences imagined as blank spaces of unrecorded antiquity rather than living, complex societies. It is not a biography of a real man. It is not a neutral portrait of an imagined poet. It is a composite, a vessel for forbidden knowledge refracted through Orientalist imagery. This reveals how the creator's persona operates as a gateway into the Necronomicon's myth, one that blends cultural specificity with the anonymity of legend, inviting readers to question not whether al-Hazred existed, but whether his disappearance signifies the book's own birth. Lovecraft's notes describe al-Hazred as wandering alone for a decade in the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, where he allegedly uncovered the buried ruins of Iram, the city of pillars, a location mentioned in the Quran but historically unverified. This triadic pattern, desert, ruins, and isolation, establishes al-Hazred not as a mere scholar, but as an initiatory figure who absorbs knowledge through extremity rather than apprenticeship. Consider carefully the effect of this framing. It positions the Necronomicon's author not in a library, but in an environment of sensory deprivation and existential scale, mirroring the book's later themes of vastness and indifference. Comparable tropes appear in other traditions: the Hebrew Enoch ascending to heaven, the medieval hermit encountering angels in wilderness, the shaman's ordeal in polar or desert spaces. Lovecraft deliberately places al-Hazred within this archetype to imply that his revelations are not products of study, but of confrontation with forces older than humanity. This reveals a profound inversion of the usual scholar-prophet narrative. Knowledge here is not received from a benevolent deity, but wrested from indifferent or hostile entities, echoing the Necronomicon's later assertion that truth is fundamentally incompatible with human comprehension. It is said that during the early Abbasid period, particularly under Caliph al-Mansur, 754-5, Baghdad became a center for translating Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, generating a vibrant cross-cultural scholarship of astronomy, medicine, and metaphysics. Lovecraft situates al-Hazred at the periphery of this real intellectual ferment, suggesting he studied the forbidden rites of the Chaldeans and the dark wisdom of Memphis, names that evoke ancient Babylonian and Egyptian traditions without specifying sources. The effect is cumulative, a scholar-poet absorbing fragments from disparate civilizations, thereby constructing a syncretic cosmology that anticipates the Necronomicon's own patchwork of citations, spells, and astronomical diagrams. Notably, this echoes the compilation methods of real grimoires such as the Picatrix, c. 11th century, which blended Arabic astrology with Greek and Indian ideas, or the Gayat al-Hakam, which survived suppression yet shaped Renaissance magic. We must pause here to recognize the pattern. By embedding Al-Hazred within a believable historical and textual environment, Lovecraft creates a meta-commentary on how forbidden knowledge moves, through translation, distortion, and rumor, not through authorized canons. This reveals the Necronomicon as not just a book, but a symbol of intellectual contraband circulating beneath official culture. Al-Hazred's alleged death in 738 CE, devoured by an invisible monster before a great multitude, stands as one of the most striking apocrypha in Lovecraft's mythology. The historian Ibn Khaldun, himself real but misquoted, becomes the conduit for this grotesque anecdote, fusing genuine medieval historiography with pulp horror. This rhetorical move accomplishes three effects simultaneously. It lends the tale a veneer of Islamic authenticity. It dramatizes the danger of the book by annihilating its creator, and it establishes a chain of testimony that is impossible to verify but difficult to dismiss. Similar patterns recur in European legends of cursed manuscripts, such as the Codex Gigas or the Voynich manuscript, where the origin story is framed by supernatural peril. It is not a neutral death. It is not even a martyrdom. It is a narrative of obliteration, a warning to anyone who might follow the same intellectual path. Consider carefully what this implies. The Necronomicon's myth begins with a vanishing, a spectacle of negation, suggesting that some knowledge cannot coexist with its possessor. This prepares the reader for the book's later reputation as a force that erases rather than enlightens, a paradox embedded within its fictional history. From the moment Lovecraft first named Al-Hazred in The Nameless City, 1921, and The Hound, 1922, he set in motion a process of myth-building that mimicked authentic scholarly transmission. Later authors, particularly August Derleth, expanded Al-Hazred's biography, giving him dates, travels, and epithets that Lovecraft himself never specified. This collaborative accretion mirrors how medieval legends about figures like Hermes Trismegistus or Apollonius of Tyana accumulated over centuries, producing composite identities whose historical cores, if any, are irretrievable. The repetition of Al-Hazred's name across stories acts as a refrain, a circular invocation that both stabilizes and destabilizes his existence. In the context of modern readers, this raises a rhetorical question. At what point does repeated fiction acquire the density of fact? It is not merely a playful hoax. It is not a casual Easter egg. It is a sustained experiment in meta-narrative, one in which Lovecraft and his successors blurred the line between authorship and archaeology. This reveals the Necronomicon's origin story as a model of how forbidden texts propagate, not through a single authorial act, but through cumulative echo, rumor, and scholarly mimicry. Al-Hazred's invented life offers more than exotic color. It articulates a philosophy of knowledge embedded in Lovecraft's work. By casting the Necronomicon's author as a liminal figure, poet, wanderer, translator, Lovecraft implies that forbidden knowledge emerges not from organized institutions, but from thresholds, between cultures, between languages, between sanity and madness. This threshold status recalls how initiatory texts in other traditions, such as the Kabbalistic Sefer Yetzirah or the apocryphal Book of Enoch, circulated at the margins of orthodoxy, promising insights but at the cost of stability. The triadic listing of desert, ruins, and revelation thus becomes a microcosm of the book's ethos: isolation, discovery, and dissolution. We must recognize that Lovecraft did not simply create a mad Arab to exoticize horror. He created a mirror through which Western readers could confront their own assumptions about knowledge, danger, and the other. This reveals a deeper inversion. The author's madness is not a personal failing, but a structural consequence of encountering truths beyond the human frame. By situating Abdul al-Hazred within a believable yet untraceable historical matrix, Lovecraft endowed the Necronomicon with a lineage that felt as ancient and fragmented as the book itself. The biography functions as a preface to the text's supposed history, a narrative threshold where life ends and manuscript begins. In the next subsection, we will follow that manuscript across centuries, its alleged translations, suppressions, and survivals, tracing how the book's aura of danger was magnified, not by what it contained, but by where it was said to travel and who dared to preserve it. The Necronomicon is introduced in Lovecraft's writings as a completed text, yet its supposed path from original manuscript to modern rumor is as labyrinthine as the cosmic visions it describes. According to Lovecraft's invented chronicle, the book began as Al-Azif, an Arabic work compiled by Abdul al-Hazred sometime before his death in 738 CE, a period in which manuscript culture flourished under the early Abbasids. The title itself, Azif, meant the nocturnal sound of insects or demons, already hinting that the book's very name encoded a warning. Consider carefully the effect of this starting point. The text is framed not as an esoteric oral tradition, but as a written, fixed artifact, yet one whose sound-based title resists containment. Comparable myths attend real grimoires such as the Testament of Solomon or the Key of Solomon, which are presented as ancient royal texts despite much later compilation. It is not a neutral origin. It is not an open transmission. It is the conjuring of a book that should never have been written at all, a paradox embedded in its fictional genesis. This reveals how Lovecraft designed the Necronomicon to feel like contraband from its very first mention. A manuscript born already cursed by the act of inscription. The next link in the book's fictional history arrives with the Greek translation attributed to Theodorus Philetas of Constantinople around 950 CE, at which point the title becomes Necronomicon. This shift from Arabic to Greek is significant not merely linguistically, but symbolically, moving the text from a culture of living revelation to one of inherited scholarship. We must recognize that by placing this translation in Constantinople, then the center of Eastern Christianity, Lovecraft mirrors the actual translation movements that transmitted Arabic science and magic to Byzantium, and later to medieval Europe. The name Necronomicon, with its triadic Greek roots, nekros, nomos, icon, sounds at once scientific and necromantic, lending the book an aura of academic legitimacy. Notably, the same pattern recurs with real texts like the Corpus Hermeticum, which passed from Hellenistic Egypt into Renaissance Europe under claims of ancient wisdom. This reveals a deliberate inversion. The Necronomicon is not simply an Arabian grimoire exoticized for Western readers, but a cosmopolitan artifact whose danger multiplies as it crosses linguistic and theological boundaries. According to the fictional chronology, a Latin translation followed in 1228 by the scholar Olaus Wormius, a name evoking both real antiquarians and the 17th century Danish savant Ole Worm. This Latin version supposedly circulated among European occultists before being condemned by Pope Gregory XI in 1232, echoing real instances of banned magic books such as the Picatrix or the Ars Notoria. Lovecraft places the Necronomicon within this rhythm of translation and suppression, Arabic to Greek to Latin, tolerated then forbidden, reproducing the arc of how dangerous knowledge historically migrates into new contexts. It is not a steady diffusion of wisdom. It is not a benign scholarly project. It is a cycle of revelation, curiosity, and censorship. Consider carefully how this fictional papal ban serves a dual function. It authenticates the book by making it seem threatening enough to outlaw, and it also warns the reader that authority cannot contain what the text reveals. The Necronomicon thus becomes a mirror of Western Christendom's own anxieties about unmediated access to forbidden truth, a theme Lovecraft threads through his mythos as a whole. Lovecraft scattered hints of surviving copies in fictional libraries, creating a topography of restricted knowledge that readers could almost plot on a map. The most famous location is the Miskatonic University Library in Arkham, Massachusetts, whose restricted section holds the Latin Necronomicon alongside other forbidden tomes. Additional copies are said to exist at the British Museum, Harvard's Widener Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and the University of Buenos Aires. This catalog of institutions, half real, half invented, functions as a pseudo-bibliography, borrowing the prestige of actual repositories to legitimize a book that never existed. Notably, this technique echoes Jorge Luis Borges's later practice in stories such as Tlön, Ukbar, Orbis Tertius, where fictional encyclopedias are embedded within real bibliographic networks. We must pause here to see the pattern. The Necronomicon's aura depends less on its content than on its geography of secrecy, its presence in places where only specialists may enter. This reveals a meta-commentary on how readers approach forbidden knowledge, not by owning it, but by imagining its locked cabinets and whispered provenance. The supposed history also includes a proliferation of forgeries and derivative works, a phenomenon mirrored in real occult traditions. Lovecraft hints at unnamed black-bound editions, rumored translations by John Dee, and whispered anecdotes of occultists who lost their sanity after glimpsing a single page. In the 20th century, actual hoax versions, most famously the Simon Necronomicon, published in 1977, would appear, blending Sumerian myth and ceremonial magic with Lovecraftian names. This recursive hoaxing illustrates a profound point. The Necronomicon mythos functions as an open-source grimoire, inviting participation from believers, skeptics, and artists alike. It is not simply a static artifact invented by one author. It is not even a closed canon. It is an evolving network of claims, counterclaims, and performative secrecy. Consider carefully how this blurring of fiction and ritual enactment transforms a literary device into a living tradition, one in which the chain of custody is not about physical books, but about imaginative possession. When viewed as a whole, the Necronomicon's fictional transmission, Arabic manuscript, Greek translation, Latin version, suppression, restricted copies, reads like a case study in how forbidden texts acquire authority. Real grimoires often gained prestige precisely because they were banned, hidden, or attributed to exotic authors. By replicating this pattern in miniature, Lovecraft created a meta-grimoire, a text that accumulates power from the very mechanisms that should discredit it. The repeated invocation of centuries, 738, 950, 12 and 28, 12 and 32, creates a rhythm of historical inevitability, a sense that each era must encounter and then recoil from the book. This reveals something profound about modern myth-making, that authenticity can be simulated not by proving a document's reality, but by mimicking the bureaucratic scars of censorship and transmission. In this sense, the Necronomicon becomes a parable of scholarship itself, suggesting that what we call history may also be a series of curated fictions. By tracing the Necronomicon's alleged path through languages, empires, and institutions, we see how Lovecraft wove a chain of transmission that feels both inevitable and untraceable. The book's supposed history functions as a mirror for our own archival desires, to believe that somewhere, in some restricted library, a final truth waits. In the next subsection, we will turn from the book's movement through time to the subtler movement within its very name, the etymologies, translations, and linguistic ambiguities that make its title as unsettling as its rumored content. The Necronomicon's power begins not in its pages, but in its title, a word that seems at once familiar and alien, constructed from recognizable Greek roots yet resisting definitive interpretation. Lovecraft claimed the title was derived from three Greek components: necros, dead, nomos, law or custom, and icon, image or representation, loosely rendered by the author himself as an image of the law of the dead. However, this translation, though linguistically plausible, is deliberately imprecise, inviting multiple readings rather than delivering clarity. We must recognize that this imprecision is not a flaw, but a feature. By constructing a name that can be decoded in overlapping ways, Lovecraft ensures that the Necronomicon always hovers just outside the realm of settled meaning. It is not a fixed translation. It is not a transparent title. It is a linguistic cipher whose ambiguity deepens the aura of secrecy. This reveals how the book's linguistic architecture mirrors its conceptual one. Meaning exists, but only in fragmented, unstable forms. Several alternate interpretations of the title have circulated since Lovecraft's time, each offering a subtly different emphasis. Some render Necronomicon as Book of Dead Names, which invokes not simply corpses, but identities, suggesting a register of forgotten beings or ancient entities whose true names remain encrypted. Others read it as Book of Laws Pertaining to the Dead, which frames it more as a legalistic manual, a codex of post-mortem governance. Still others translate it more abstractly as Book of the Customs of the Dead, imbuing it with ethnographic undertones. Consider carefully how each variation activates a different kind of dread. Names suggest invocation, laws imply transgression. Customs evoke rituals older than memory. This triadic layering transforms the title into a prism, refracting horror through linguistic nuance. Unlike most fictional grimoires, whose names lean toward blunt dramatics, the Necronomicon engages the reader intellectually before it disturbs them emotionally. It is not a scream, it is an incantation in academic disguise. The idea of a book composed of dead laws or forgotten names resonates with earlier mythic texts from various traditions. In the Book of Enoch, angelic secrets are revealed that were never meant for human eyes. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the soul navigates a bureaucracy of divine judgment. In the Kabbalistic Sefer Yetzirah, letters themselves are treated as cosmological engines. Each of these texts treats language as a system capable of altering reality, not merely describing it. The Necronomicon, by echoing this lineage, positions itself as both heir and distortion. Notably in ancient magical traditions, particularly among the Greeks and Gnostics, names were not labels, but keys, unlocking hidden properties of gods or demons. We must pause here to consider what it means for a book's title to carry this weight. It implies that to even speak its name is to begin a process of alignment with forces that predate articulation itself. This reveals how the Necronomicon's linguistic construction turns the very act of naming into a form of metaphysical exposure. Before it was called Necronomicon, the book was known supposedly as Al-Azif, a term Lovecraft defined as the nocturnal sound, supposed to be the howling of demons heard by Arabs. While this word is not attested in actual Arabic usage, it plausibly mimics the phonetic structure of genuine terms, blurring the boundary between invented vocabulary and real linguistic forms. In classical Arabic, the triliteral root zaf could hypothetically imply buzzing or eerie resonance. Although no such root is officially recorded, still, the term carries the rhythm of authenticity. Consider this carefully. Al-Azif is not a title that describes content. It is a sound, a presence, a frequency. This naming moves the Necronomicon away from the rational world of book titles and into a register of auditory contagion. It is not a title to be read. It is a signal to be heard, perhaps even without consent. This reveals Lovecraft's larger linguistic strategy, to destabilize meaning not only through ambiguity, but through sensory suggestion. The Necronomicon's name functions as what we might call a semantic trap. The more one attempts to translate or explain it, the more its meaning mutates. Lovecraft, ever the architect of suggestion, never quoted directly from the book in his fiction. He allowed only glimpses, phrases, allusions, corrupted passages. Thus the title becomes the totality. It must bear the entire imaginative weight of the book. Necronomicon appears frequently in Lovecraft's corpus, often uttered in hushed tones or buried in footnotes, reinforcing the idea that the name alone carries power. In rhetorical terms, this creates a synecdochic horror. The part, the name, stands in for the whole, the unknowable content. It is not a title meant to clarify. It is a mechanism of implication. This reveals a deeper psychological design. Readers are invited to speculate, to fill the void, and in doing so, to participate in the book's recursive madness. Linguistically, the Necronomicon exists at the border between cognition and corruption. In Lovecraft's stories, language itself becomes unstable after exposure to the book. Scholars forget their native tongues, dream in unknown alphabets, or descend into glossolalia. This mirrors real-world fears about textual contamination found in ancient cultures. The idea that some scriptures are too dangerous to recite, some names too powerful to utter. Compare this with the Tetragrammaton in Jewish mysticism, whose true pronunciation is hidden, or the Islamic prohibition against certain magical invocations of the jinn. The Necronomicon's title inherits this lineage of linguistic prohibition, functioning not just as a marker of content, but as a threshold. We must recognize that this threshold is not external, it is psychological. The book's name lingers in the mind, not because it is graphic or grotesque, but because it activates a philosophical horror. That, meaning itself, can be dangerous. By dissecting the Necronomicon's name, its Greek composition, Arabic echo, and symbolic excess, we find that the title alone serves as a microcosm of the text's entire mythos. It is a name designed to resist resolution, to unsettle through ambiguity, and to gesture toward content that remains, always, just beyond our reach. In the next subsection, we will explore how Lovecraft built this same effect into the very texture of the book's presentation, through pseudo-scholarship, metatextual layering, and literary sleight of hand that made a fictional grimoire feel like a historical inevitability. The enduring mystique of the Necronomicon lies not merely in its invented history or its unsettling title, but in the way H.P. Lovecraft constructed it using literary techniques that mirror legitimate scholarly apparatus. From its first appearance in The Hound, 1922, the Necronomicon is treated not as an imaginary object of fancy, but as a reference source, often cited with author, date, and translation lineage, complete with invented publishers, translators, and disputed versions. This mimics the structure of real academic texts and theological grimoires, where footnotes, bibliographies, and cross-references signify authority. Consider carefully what this technique accomplishes. It does not prove the Necronomicon's reality, but rather simulates the evidentiary scaffolding that convinces readers of a source's legitimacy. It is not fantasy masquerading as truth. It is fiction weaponizing the syntax of truth. This reveals a larger metaliterary insight. That belief can be coaxed not by what a text says, but by how it appears to belong within an ecosystem of knowledge. Lovecraft did not isolate the Necronomicon in his tales. Rather, he embedded it within a lattice of real and fictional references. In The Dunwich Horror and The Dreams in the Witch House, the book sits alongside actual esoteric works like the Ars Magna and the Book of Dzyan, as well as invented ones such as the Pennacotic manuscripts and Unaussprechlichen Kulten by the fictitious Friedrich von Junst. This blending of real and unreal sources serves a dual purpose. It makes the imaginary seem plausible by association, and it destabilizes the real by proximity to the invented. We must pause here to reflect on a literary sleight of hand. Lovecraft does not ask the reader to suspend disbelief, but rather to misplace belief, to assign credibility by pattern, not by content. It is not merely a matter of making the Necronomicon feel real. It is about making the reader uncertain where reality ends and invention begins. This reveals a recursive truth. The book gains power not by standing apart, but by hiding in plain sight among things we already trust. One of Lovecraft's most effective literary decisions was his near-complete refusal to quote directly from the Necronomicon. Readers are given only fragments, partial phrases, corrupted lines, references to passages whose full contents are never revealed. This technique mirrors real-world taboos in sacred or cursed literature, such as the Qumranic interdiction against publicly reciting angelic names, or the medieval belief that reading certain grimoires aloud could summon spirits inadvertently. By withholding the book's content, Lovecraft turns the Necronomicon into a textual negative space. Its power is felt precisely because it is never fully seen. It is not a book of spells in the conventional sense. It is a book that implies spells so dangerous, their mere description is a liability. This reveals a literary paradox. What is left unread becomes more potent than what is stated, creating horror not from the grotesque, but from the withheld. Almost immediately after its introduction, readers and correspondents began writing to Lovecraft asking where they could purchase the Necronomicon, unaware or unwilling to accept that it was an invention. Later, during the 1970s and 1980s, actual editions were published claiming to be reconstructions or translations of the book, most notably the so-called Simon Necronomicon, which combined Lovecraftian terminology with Babylonian demonology and ceremonial magic. The fact that such hoaxes gained traction speaks less to gullibility and more to the success of Lovecraft's literary strategy. His fictional book had achieved a form of referential density, an idea so consistently treated as real that it began to generate its own independent mythology. This was not merely fan enthusiasm. It was a migration from fiction to folklore. It is not the first time this has occurred. Consider the Malleus Maleficarum, a 15th century witch-hunting manual whose authority was magnified through repetition, despite its disputed legitimacy, even in its own time. This reveals a haunting implication. Literary technique, applied rigorously, can produce belief structures that outlive and outgrow their original creators. Lovecraft was not the sole architect of the Necronomicon's mythos. His peers, August Derleth, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, expanded on the book in their own stories, treating it as a shared artifact rather than private invention. This collaborative illusion mimics how actual grimoires evolved through centuries of anonymous additions, redactions, and reimaginings. By opening the myth to others, Lovecraft surrendered authorial control in favor of mythic momentum. The Necronomicon thus becomes not a book authored once, but a book that authors itself through collective storytelling. This reflects a broader pattern in esoteric traditions, where knowledge is always partial, evolving, and never fully in the hands of a single lineage. Consider carefully the inversion. It is not Lovecraft who controls the book's meaning, but the book that begins to control the narratives it inhabits. This reveals the Necronomicon as a living text, not in the biological sense, but in the cultural sense, capable of mutating, reproducing, and embedding itself into new ideological ecosystems. All of this culminates in a single, disquieting question. Can a book that never existed still be dangerous? The Necronomicon forces us to consider how belief operates, not through verification, but through structure, tone, and repetition. If enough readers act as though a text is real, if they imagine its pages, whisper its name, or claim its influence, does it acquire a kind of reality by cultural consensus? This is not a rhetorical trick. It is a philosophical inquiry into the nature of textual power. Compare this to the concept of the egregore in occult theory, a thought form or collective idea that gains momentum through shared attention. The Necronomicon, we might argue, is an egregore of literature, imagined, referenced, feared, and enacted. We must recognize that Lovecraft's literary technique was not merely about scaring readers. It was about building a self-replicating system of implication and doubt. This reveals a final, unsettling truth. The Necronomicon does not need to exist on paper. It exists wherever imagination fears its own limits, through footnotes, withheld passages, and strategic citation. Lovecraft crafted the Necronomicon not as a book to be read, but as a book to be believed in, misunderstood, and half-remembered. Its authenticity is not historical, it is psychological, literary, and cultural. In the next section of our investigation, we will open the metaphorical cover and peer into the thematic core of the Necronomicon itself, the philosophical concepts it embodies, the entities it describes, the madness it breeds, and the metaphysical implications of knowing what one should not. At its core, the Necronomicon is not a repository of spells, secrets, or rituals in the conventional sense. It is a philosophical provocation. Its implied content, hinted at across Lovecraft's oeuvre, centers not on power, but on truth so antithetical to the human condition that their mere contemplation induces collapse. Lovecraft did not craft the Necronomicon to be used, but to be feared as an idea. We must recognize that the book functions as an epistemological device, what philosopher Timothy Morton might call a hyper-object, something so vast and complex that it cannot be perceived in totality, only glimpsed in fragments. It is not simply forbidden because of morality. It is forbidden because the mind cannot survive it. This sets the Necronomicon apart from traditional grimoires. It is not a bridge to knowledge, but a trapdoor into unmaking. This reveals a core principle of Lovecraft's cosmicism. Knowledge is not redemptive. It is corrosive. The Necronomicon presents, both directly and through implication, a universe that is not only uncaring, but fundamentally indifferent to humanity's existence. Lovecraft coined the term cosmic indifferentism, to contrast with theological dualisms of good versus evil. The entities cataloged in the Necronomicon, Yog-Sothoth, Azathoth, Shub-Niggurath, are not malicious. They are incommensurate. They occupy spatial and temporal dimensions that render human concerns microscopic, even delusional. This cosmic worldview draws on emerging scientific paradigms of Lovecraft's time, particularly astronomical discoveries in the early 20th century that revealed Earth's triviality in a vast and expanding universe. Compare this with Blaise Pascal's earlier dread of the eternal silence of infinite spaces. Lovecraft transforms that dread into narrative architecture. It is not that the gods are dead, it is that they were never interested. This philosophical pivot moves horror away from evil and toward irrelevance. One of the Necronomicon's recurring implications is that madness is not a flaw of the reader, but a symptom of ontological friction. In story after story, the Dunwich Horror, the Whisperer in Darkness, At the Mountains of Madness, characters who engage too deeply with the book suffer psychological disintegration. But this is not moralistic punishment, it is logical consequence. The human mind, evolutionarily adapted for survival in a narrow bandwidth of reality, cannot withstand contact with truths that operate on non-Euclidean geometries, recursive time, or entities that experience all states simultaneously. In modern psychological terms, one might compare this to cognitive dissonance weaponized into metaphysical trauma. Consider carefully the inversion here. In traditional literature, madness signals deviation from truth. In Lovecraft, madness is the truth. This reveals a redefinition of sanity, not as health, but as an accidental byproduct of ignorance. Within the conceptual gravity of the Necronomicon, Lovecraft destabilizes foundational human categories: time, language, and perception. Yog-Sothoth, often described as coexistent with all time and space, embodies the collapse of linear chronology, while the dream state incursions of Nyarlathotep suggest that linguistic meaning can shift depending on dimensional position. The Necronomicon frequently implies that reality is not singular, but layered, an architectural model more than a temporal flow. This echoes philosophical models like Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, or the cyclical time in Hindu cosmology. But unlike those traditions, the Necronomicon offers no rebirth, no wisdom, no liberation. It offers only collapse. Language fails, vision fragments, identity dissolves. We must recognize this deliberate philosophical void. The Necronomicon does not explain the universe. It exposes the insufficiency of every model that tries. This reveals a terrifying implication. Not that we are wrong about the universe, but that the universe was never designed to be understood by us. In traditional esoteric systems, forbidden knowledge is hidden to preserve sacredness or prevent misuse. In the Necronomicon, knowledge is forbidden, because it should not exist in relation to the human psyche. Characters who engage with it are not guilty of sin. They are guilty of curiosity without caution. This ethical dilemma, whether one should seek truth even if it destroys meaning, is mirrored in real-world scientific and philosophical debates. Consider Oppenheimer's quote upon witnessing the atomic bomb: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The Necronomicon functions similarly. It invites the reader to become something incompatible with life as it was previously known. It is not a moral text. It is not even an amoral one. It is anti-ethical. This reveals a chilling inversion of Enlightenment ideals. Knowledge may not liberate, it may enslave, deform, or annihilate. What separates the Necronomicon from other fictional grimoires is the idea that knowledge is not something one acquires. It is something that acquires you. Readers do not study the book. They become conduits for its influence. They dream differently. They speak in unfamiliar tongues. They are written upon rather than writing. This echoes ancient models of possession found in Gnostic and shamanic traditions, where divine or demonic forces overwrite individual identity. However, in Lovecraft's framework, this possession is not purposeful, it is structural. The book is like a linguistic virus that rewrites cognition upon contact. We must pause here to observe a disturbing implication. The Necronomicon is not dangerous because it is read. It is dangerous because it exists. To know of it is already to be touched by its logic. From the loss of time and self to the erosion of sanity and language, the Necronomicon articulates a world where knowing is indistinguishable from unmaking. It does not comfort or empower, it dismantles. In the next subsection, we will explore the specific entities and cosmological structures that the Necronomicon describes, beings whose very nature stretches the limits of concept and whose presence further solidifies the text's reputation as the deadliest book never written. It would be a mistake to approach the Necronomicon as a mere catalogue of monsters, for its greatest terror lies not in its taxonomy, but in the vast disorientation of its referential web. The text does not offer a bestiary in the medieval sense, complete, moralized, and anthropocentric, but rather a shifting pantheon of names and non-names that undermine our trust in the linguistic act itself. Within its pages, the reader encounters entities that are at once gods, dimensions, and diseases, impossibly vast, paradoxically intimate, and ontologically corrosive. These entities, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, Shub-Niggurath, Azathoth, are not simply characters in a mythology, but philosophical nodes through which reality itself bends and frays. It is not the quantity of detail that haunts, but the way in which those details consistently destabilize meaning. We must recognize the foundational function of Cthulhu not as an apex predator, but as a conceptual rupture, a discontinuity in the human mind's capacity to grasp its own insignificance. First introduced in Lovecraft's 1928 story, The Call of Cthulhu, this entity is described as a gelatinous amalgam of octopus, dragon, and humanoid, yet none of these images suffice. The famous line, a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head, is less description than placeholder, a semiotic failure masked in language. According to the Necronomicon, Cthulhu lies dead but dreaming in the sunken city of R'lyeh, neither alive nor truly dead, but suspended in a dreamlike latency that might someday burst into waking. This liminality, this refusal of ontological category, recurs throughout the entities described in the book. Cthulhu is not a monster, but a metaphor for the return of the repressed on a civilizational scale. Azathoth, conversely, is treated within the mythos as the ultimate center, the blind idiot god, the demon sultan who gnaws hungrily in chaos outside the ordered universe. It is worth noting that Lovecraft originally conceived Azathoth as a parody of creation itself, a blasphemous inversion of the Abrahamic god. But the Necronomicon presents Azathoth as even more than that, a philosophical abyss. One must ask, what does it mean for the cosmos to be ruled not by a sentient force, but by a blind, gibbering chaos? In the 1930s, Lovecraft increasingly referred to Azathoth in letters as a kind of cosmic nucleus, a locus of idiocy around which all matter spins. Compare this to the Gnostic conception of the demiurge, not an evil god, but a foolish one. The resemblance is not accidental. Azathoth's unreason is not a flaw. It is the governing principle of existence itself. This reveals something disturbing, that what we call order may be the product of an idiot's dream. Yog-Sothoth, on the other hand, functions not as an antagonist, but as an interface, described in multiple texts as the key in the gate, the guardian of the gate, and the gate itself. Yog-Sothoth is less a deity than a dimensional mechanism. In the Dunwich Horror, 1929, the creature is summoned in a failed ritual of hybridization, resulting in an invisible offspring that wreaks havoc across the Massachusetts countryside. Yet, in the Necronomicon, Yog-Sothoth's presence is always epistemological. It knows, it sees, it encompasses. And herein lies the deeper dread. Yog-Sothoth does not threaten the body, but the schema by which the human mind navigates cause and effect. It is not evil. It is not good. It is the structure of reality unveiled, too quickly, too completely. The book's invocation of Yog-Sothoth is always paired with diagrams, spirals, or mathematical symbols that seem to dissolve into visual noise. This deliberate illegibility is key to its effect. We are not meant to understand, only to know that understanding is no longer possible. Then, there is Nyarlathotep, the so-called crawling chaos, unique among the pantheon for his apparent agency and interaction with humans. While most cosmic entities are indifferent to humanity, Nyarlathotep delights in manipulation. Lovecraft first introduced him in 1920 as a dark prophet traversing the earth, showing strange technologies and inciting madness. In the Necronomicon, Nyarlathotep appears as a narrative thread, a linking agent, a conscious corrupter, a voice among the static. His myriad forms are not disguises but invitations, each designed to draw the human psyche closer to collapse. In contrast to Azathoth's idiocy, or Cthulhu's slumber, Nyarlathotep is awake, aware, and amused. Scholars often compare him to the trickster archetype from African and Native American mythology, figures who reveal cosmic truths by inverting logic and violating norms. Yet here the trickster is unbound by moral arc. His aim is not balance, but entropy through intimacy. One cannot neglect the role of Shub-Niggurath, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young. Her epithets in the Necronomicon suggest a different axis of horror: fertility, multiplication, the perverse continuum of creation. In a 1933 letter to Clark Ashton Smith, Lovecraft described her as a kind of perverted fertility deity, a shadow of Pan or Ishtar, yet infinitely more grotesque. She is invoked, never directly described, her presence marked by excessive growth, flesh, and the collapse of boundary. Not death, but too much life. Not decay, but generative corruption. Consider carefully the implications. If Azathoth embodies meaningless creation and Nyarlathotep intentional destruction, Shub-Niggurath signifies unstoppable replication. In a post-industrial world where systems multiply without purpose, her relevance only grows. Throughout these descriptions, a pattern emerges. The entities of the Necronomicon are not adversaries in the traditional sense, but vectors of unknowing. They do not seek worship. They do not offer bargains. They exist in friction with our conceptual frameworks. This is why repeated exposure to the text is said to cause madness, not due to horrific visuals, but due to epistemological erosion. The human mind, having evolved to seek coherence, begins to fray when faced with recursive impossibility. The more one studies the book's entities, the more language itself seems inadequate. And perhaps that is the point. It is not simply the monsters that unsettle us. It is the suggestion that even in naming them, we have already failed. Madness in the Necronomicon is not an unfortunate byproduct of cosmic exposure. It is a structural necessity. It operates not merely as a narrative device to elicit horror, but as an epistemological outcome, a terminal symptom of interfacing with realities beyond human calibration. When readers or characters go mad, they are not failing to withstand horror. They are experiencing the world's underlying architecture reformatting their cognition. It is not that madness follows horror. It is that horror is the revelation that madness was always the truth. We must recognize that in Lovecraft's mythos, insanity is often portrayed not as delusion, but as unwanted clarity. Consider Abdul al-Hazred himself, the supposed author of the Necronomicon, who is described as having devoured many strange things, and wandered the ruins of Babylon and the subterranean secrets of Memphis. The mythology asserts that he was devoured in broad daylight by an invisible monster in 738 CE, a fitting end for one who saw too much. Madness here is not illness, but illumination. We are reminded of classical Greek thought, particularly in the tragic vision of Euripides, where divine revelation often comes paired with mental disintegration. In such frameworks, madness is not a fall from grace, but a state of being touched by the inhuman divine. In this sense, the Necronomicon participates in a long literary tradition where unfiltered knowledge corrupts. The biblical book of Ecclesiastes declares that, with much wisdom comes much sorrow, and Renaissance occult texts, from Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, 1531, to the Picatrix, frequently warn that to study too deeply is to risk derangement. Yet in Lovecraft's world, the madness is not a spiritual warning. It is a scientific inevitability. Exposure to non-Euclidean geometry, to entities existing simultaneously across time and space, to the realization that human consciousness is an anomaly rather than a crown. This is not metaphorical breakdown. It is cognitive collapse. The brain, faced with recursive contradiction, defaults into paradox. It is not fear. It is not trauma. It is system failure. One might ask, why then would any sentient being risk exposure to such a book? The answer is grim and telling. In many stories, madness is not pursued but inflicted. Those who stumble upon forbidden knowledge do so unintentionally, through dreams, inheritance, or scholarly arrogance. Take the narrator of The Dreams in the Witch House, 1932, whose studies in advanced mathematics and folklore lead him to unwitting communion with Nyarlathotep through curved space-time dreams. His descent into psychosis is presented as both an accident and an inevitability. It is not that he sought madness, it is that madness found a structure in his mind, something to anchor itself upon. This reveals a troubling philosophical implication. Madness may be the default outcome of unchecked inquiry. The Necronomicon does not warn against madness, it describes it with clinical detachment. Repeated phrases within the text, the thin veil, the crawling of perception, the curvature of time, suggest an internal lexicon for the symptoms of unraveling. Scholars of the mythos often note how these phrases mimic the language of psychiatric case studies in the early 20th century, particularly the works of Bleuler and Kraepelin. But Lovecraft's innovation lies in recoding this language for metaphysical purposes. A delusion is not simply a break from reality. It is a misalignment with a greater, more terrible truth. This idea finds echoes in Gnostic cosmology, wherein the material world is a prison crafted by a blind creator, and only through painful awakening does one glimpse the true structure of being. Madness, in this context, is not dysfunction, it is disobedience. Let us pause here and consider the cultural function of such portrayals. Why has the Necronomicon, a fictional text, become so persistently associated with mental instability? The answer may lie in its use as a metaphorical mirror. In modernity, defined by acceleration, fragmentation, and the collapse of absolute truths, madness serves as both a warning and a reflection. It is not simply what happens when we lose touch with the world. It is what happens when the world becomes too much to touch. The book's warnings are not moral, but ontological. They do not say, "Do not seek." They say, "If you seek, prepare to be undone." And that is an altogether different kind of caution. In sum, the function of madness in the Necronomicon is neither decorative nor incidental. It is the logical end of all forbidden knowledge. Just as a circuit fries when too much voltage passes through, the human psyche disintegrates when it is forced to hold two contradictory realities at once: the comforting lie of order and the devouring truth of indifference. Madness is not failure, it is alignment. And in that alignment, the individual ceases to be. Forbidden knowledge lies at the very heart of the Necronomicon. It is not simply one of its themes, it is its reason for existing. Where other fictional grimoires provide instruction or insight, the Necronomicon exists to tempt, corrupt, and ultimately annihilate the boundary between thought and the unspeakable. It is not a book to be read, it is a book that rewrites those who attempt to read it. This inversion, that knowledge does not enlighten but consumes, is the philosophical rupture Lovecraft introduces, not with hysteria, but with clinical calm. The motif of forbidden knowledge has long been foundational in world literature and religious myth. From the Hebrew Genesis myth of the Tree of Knowledge to the Promethean myth of fire theft in Greek tradition, human overreach is consistently framed as dangerous yet inevitable. However, the Necronomicon departs from these earlier structures in one crucial respect. The knowledge it offers is not empowering, but destabilizing. It does not offer divine fire or hidden wisdom. It offers revelation of humanity's insignificance. It is not the knowledge of gods, it is the awareness that gods do not care. This reveals a dark philosophical implication. In Lovecraft's cosmology, knowledge does not set us free. It reveals there was never freedom to begin with. We must pause here to understand the text's psychological allure. If the Necronomicon truly only brought madness, why do so many fictional characters, and so many real readers, obsess over it? This is not curiosity. It is compulsion. As literary critic S.T. Joshi noted in his 1996 treatise The Weird Tale, the Necronomicon is a paradox of the intellect. The more the mind senses danger, the more it presses forward. The book, in this sense, functions like a black hole of cognition. Its gravity increases the closer one gets. The closer the reader inches toward revelation, the more impossible it becomes to turn back. Consider the recurring triad of consequences in stories featuring the Necronomicon: obsession, revelation, annihilation. This structure is seen as early as The Hound, 1922, where grave robbers become consumed by knowledge of the ancient and unspeakable. It repeats in The Dunwich Horror, 1929, where academic study of the book does not prevent disaster, but rather ensures it occurs with surgical precision. And again, in The Thing on the Doorstep, 1937, where reading the Necronomicon transfers identity itself, souls traded like bookmarks. This is not simply horror, it is horror embedded in the pursuit of truth. The book does not punish curiosity. It rewards it in the most annihilating way. It is not the act of reading that is dangerous. It is the kind of knowledge being pursued. In traditional epistemologies, knowledge is framed as cumulative and constructive, a ladder toward enlightenment. The Necronomicon proposes an inverted ladder, one that descends into layers of cosmic indifference, each deeper than the last. Compare this to alchemical texts like The Book of the Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage, 1458, or John Dee's Monas Hieroglyphica, 1564, which suggests that hidden knowledge brings one closer to God or transcendence. The Necronomicon, in contrast, erodes transcendence itself. It is not enlightenment, it is dissolution. This philosophical inversion carries broader implications. If truth itself is harmful, then the entire intellectual project of humanity becomes suspect. Consider carefully, what does it mean to live in a world where certain knowledge must be avoided? Not because it is dangerous in the practical sense, but because it erodes the stability of consciousness. The implication is not simply that ignorance is bliss, it is that ignorance is survival. And this, perhaps, is the most terrifying proposition of all. The repeated language within Necronomicon-inspired texts. The veil must not be lifted. The names are not to be spoken. The gate is a mind, reveals that the knowledge offered is not encrypted but veiled. It is not hidden but forbidden. This distinction is critical. Something hidden can be found. Something forbidden is placed behind a psychic wall for the sake of all reality. The difference is not semantic. It is moral. It is not that humans cannot understand. It is that they should not. And yet, paradoxically, the act of writing the Necronomicon presupposes the desire to communicate that which cannot be known. This creates a recursive loop. The book exists to warn against itself. Every page is a philosophical trap. To read is to remember. To remember is to awaken. To awaken is to cease being human. One might ask, is the Necronomicon truly about forbidden knowledge? Or is it itself a ritual, a conceptual object that enacts what it describes simply by being imagined? This would make it not a text, but a mimetic entity. Not literature, but a psychic infection. It is not a book of spells. It is not a treatise of truths. It is a mirror turned toward the void. And for those who look too long, the void does not blink. It is both ironic and inevitable that the most infamous grimoire in horror literature was never meant to exist as a full text. The Necronomicon made its first appearance not as a manuscript, but as a whisper, an echo embedded within another story. It appeared not in a bookshop, nor in a library, but in the margins of Lovecraft's 1922 tale, The Hound, where it is cited casually, without introduction, as if its infamy were already assumed. This technique, referencing the forbidden without explanation, allowed Lovecraft to create what literary scholar Eric Davis later described as a textual phantom, a book more present in suggestion than in substance. Lovecraft expanded upon this fictional source gradually and with remarkable consistency. In The Nameless City, written 1921, published 1923, the Necronomicon is first attributed to the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, with vague references to forgotten gods and ancient rituals. By the time of the Dunwich Horror, 1929, and The Whisperer in Darkness, 1931, the book had acquired a pseudo-scholarly reputation. Various editions, translated by fictional academics, stored in real university libraries like Miskatonic. It is not simply a recurring prop. It becomes a mythological through-line. Each mention accrues weight. Each citation expands its fiction. We must recognize the brilliance of this method. Lovecraft did not begin with a tome and then insert it into stories. He allowed the audience to piece the tome together from its residues. This mirrors the experience of reading any ancient text in fragments: Sappho, Heraclitus, the Gnostic Gospels. The reader reconstructs what never fully existed, thereby making the illusion more powerful. The Necronomicon's first appearances, therefore, establish a literary model of recursive truth. The book exists because it is cited. It is cited because it has always existed. Fiction becomes function. This recursive presence separates the Necronomicon from other invented books. In Goethe's Faust, the titular character possesses books of magic, but they serve as symbols of ambition or moral conflict. In Borges's Tlön, Uqbar Orbis Tertius, 1940, the fictional encyclopedia shapes reality itself. But Borges wrote after Lovecraft. The Uwais Necronomicon is not merely an object, it is a networked literary presence. It does not reside in one story, but hovers between them. It is not a plot device, it is a mythology device. This reveals something profound. The horror is not in what it says, but that it keeps appearing again and again, like an idea that cannot be killed. Consider the dates: The Hound, 1922, The Nameless City, 1923, The Dunwich Horror, 1929, The Whisperer in Darkness, 1931, The Thing on the Doorstep, 1937. In less than 2 decades, Lovecraft created a fictional book with a publishing timeline. The Necronomicon acquires layers, versions, editions, commentaries, burned copies. Readers tracked these references, cataloged them, and, crucially, began to write about the Necronomicon as if it were a real book. We must pause here. This shift, from fictional device to subject of inquiry, marks the beginning of its infection of reality. It is not the invention that matters, it is the insistence. The Necronomicon did not seduce readers through spectacle. It crept into consciousness through familiarity. It was not presented with fanfare, it was embedded in footnotes. This echoes the technique of Victorian forgeries, such as the Voynich manuscript and the Ora Linda book, which relied on the reader's willingness to engage with incomplete truths. But Lovecraft's approach was cleaner, more subtle. He did not forge a document, he forged belief in a document. The difference is not literary, it is psychological. And yet, even as it grew in prominence, the Necronomicon remained paradoxical. It is famous, but unreadable, feared, but non-existent. It is not an object, but an orbit, a gravitational pull around which stories collapse and reform. In this way, its first appearances did not introduce it. They implied it had always been there. This is the genius of its construction. It haunts the canon, not as a book, but as a question. What if the most dangerous idea in human history could be footnoted into existence? The answer, it seems, is still unfolding. If one wishes to understand the narrative function of the Necronomicon within Lovecraft's mythos, the Dunwich Horror, written in 1928 and published in Weird Tales in April 1929, is the essential case study. Here, the book shifts from background lore to an operational tool within the plot. It is cited, read aloud from, and used in a climactic ritual to banish a threat that is, quite literally, invisible. This is not a passive object. It becomes an instrument. But even more than that, it becomes a philosophical hinge upon which the story balances, between ignorance and revelation, between silence and utterance, between the seen and the unseen. The plot of the Dunwich Horror centers on the Whately family in rural Massachusetts, degenerates by local standards, but, as it turns out, participants in a deeper transgression, the interbreeding of human and cosmic forces. Old Wizard Whately, his albino daughter Lavinia, and her deformed son. Wilbur exists not only outside social norms, but outside genetic boundaries. The Necronomicon is Wilbur's inheritance, not simply a book passed down, but a birthright of forbidden access. It is not a tool he finds, it is a legacy he enacts. This is the shift. The book becomes genealogical. We must pause here to consider the book's role as ritual apparatus. In this story, the Necronomicon is consulted by Wilbur to complete a summoning, and later by Professor Armitage to banish the summoned horror. Both sides use the same text, but only one does so to preserve human coherence. The irony is that both presume mastery over the unknowable. This reveals something profound. The book functions not as an answer, but as a test. It is not knowledge itself that corrupts, but the assumption of control. Consider carefully the duality at work. Wilbur seeks to release his father, Yog-Sothoth, a being described in the Necronomicon as existing at all points in space and time simultaneously. His twin, born invisible and kept hidden by the family, becomes the literal manifestation of that transgression. A being whose presence warps space, destroys structures, and exists without boundaries. What Wilbur opens with the book, Armitage must close with the same. Thus the Necronomicon becomes a threshold, a thing that separates what must be kept apart and allows passage when misused. It is not simply a spellbook. It is not merely a prop. It is a fulcrum for narrative collapse. We must recognize that Lovecraft here enacts a larger principle of cosmic horror, that the greatest danger is not monstrous beings, but the permeability of reality's membrane. The Necronomicon is not dangerous because of what it contains. It is dangerous because it reminds us that the boundary between reality and unreality is negotiable. In the Dunwich Horror, this is literalized. A being passes through. It speaks. It is banished, but only barely. This circular repetition of threshold, inheritance, and invisibility is crucial. Wilbur does not merely inherit the book, he embodies it. His life is a ritual, his body a bridge, his death, killed by a guard dog while attempting to steal the Miskatonic University copy of the Necronomicon, is the failure of unauthorized access. His twin brother, the Invisible Horror, is the consequence of a ritual unfinished, a script half-spoken. Even Armitage's success in the end feels provisional. He may have read the words aloud, but what were the words truly for? The ritual ends, but the text remains. It is not just the Dunwich Horror that hinges on these themes. In works such as The Call of Cthulhu, the idea of inherited cult knowledge and scattered manuscripts echoes this story's central motif. But only in the Dunwich Horror does the book itself act, perform, participate. It is not quoted for flavor, it is deployed as weapon. This sets it apart not only from other Lovecraft stories, but from broader horror literature. In Dracula, a vampire is defeated by faith and science. In the Dunwich Horror, the monster is silenced by incantation. Incantation drawn from a book that no one understands fully. That uncertainty is the point. What does it mean when the solution is just as obscure as the problem? When the ritual to banish the horror comes from the same place that birthed it? The Dunwich Horror asks not whether evil can be stopped, but whether the tools of the cosmos can be borrowed without cost. And the Necronomicon, in that equation, is both key and question. It opens, it closes, it survives. One suspects it always will. The Dreams in the Witch House, first written in January to February of 1932 and published in Weird Tales in July 1933, offers a markedly different but equally potent deployment of the Necronomicon. Whereas the Dunwich Horror treated the text as ritual scaffolding for summoning and banishment, here it becomes a whispered undertone behind experiments in mathematics, sleep, and the architecture of the mind. Walter Gilman, the protagonist, is not a cultist or a scholar of myth, but a student. Brilliant, curious, unprepared. He believes he is studying non-Euclidean geometry. He is, in fact, studying the physics of sacrificial space. This story is not about translation of words, but about the translation of reality. The Necronomicon is not foregrounded in Witch House, but it looms over the text like an untranslated equation. Gilman is said to consult it during his research into certain black books in the Miskatonic University Library. But what matters is not what he reads, it is what he internalizes. The Necronomicon here functions as silent architecture, not spoken command. Its rituals are embedded in dream logic, encoded in curves and lines, in angles that defy perception. This is no longer a book one reads, it is a book one inhabits. We must pause here and recognize the shift. The Dunwich Horror used the Necronomicon to invoke and resolve an external crisis. The Dreams in the Witch House uses it to erode the internal self. There is no clean ritual, no banishment, no final line. There is only the slow seep of unreality. And crucially, Gilman does not believe in the mythos at first. He does not approach the text as a believer. This reveals something profound. Belief is not a shield. Exposure itself is enough. Consider carefully the layers of reality Lovecraft constructs. Gilman dreams of traveling through abstract space, curves and angles that shouldn't exist. He witnesses rituals beyond language. He meets the child-eating witch Keziah Mason, her familiar brown Jenkin, and the Black Man, possibly Nyarlathotep in yet another mask. The sacrificial rites he is drawn into are not presented as symbolic, but as geometrically necessary. The victim is not chosen for drama, but for alignment. This is not demonic, it is architectural. The horror here is not spiritual, but mathematical. It is not just a horror story. It is not even just cosmic horror. It is ritualized quantum fatalism. The Dreams in the Witch House presents a cosmology in which the Necronomicon exists not as a grimoire, but as a spatial interface, an operating system for altered dimensions. It is this reinterpretation that sets the story apart. The text is not cited, it is enacted, not read, but lived, not memorized, but geometrized. We return again and again to 5 words in this story: geometry, threshold, ritual, dream, untranslated. These terms form a circular orbit. Gilman is drawn into the geometry of the witch house itself, a structure whose proportions violate Cartesian stability. The house is a gate. The rituals he participates in, some remembered, some forgotten, are embedded in the angles of the building. The dreams he has are not dreams, but interdimensional passages, and the rituals, left untranslated, are still obeyed. This echoes traditions found in both Western and Eastern esoteric architecture. The ziggurats of Sumeria, the labyrinths of Crete, the stepped stupas of Tibet. It parallels the sacred geometry encoded in Renaissance alchemy and the dream practices of Australian Aboriginal cosmology. But Lovecraft strips away any human-centered spirituality. There are no wise guides, no sacred insights, only inevitability. What do we make of a ritual we can only half understand, yet still perform? What do we become when the space we occupy completes the incantation for us? In The Dreams in the Witch House, the Necronomicon is no longer a book. It is a location, a field equation, a psychological topography. Gilman does not open its pages. He walks its perimeter. He crosses its axis. And in the end, he is consumed by it. He is found dead, bloodied, ritualized, his body echoing a geometry no human hand drew. The sacrifice is completed, but the book is not closed, because it was never opened in the first place. We must recognize that the Necronomicon, though conceived by Lovecraft as fiction, has never belonged to him alone. From the earliest days of the mythos, it became something far stranger than a literary invention, a shared hallucination, passed between authors like a ritual object, reshaped, yet never entirely abandoned. What began as a grim joke in a few stories soon evolved into a canonized artifact, whose reality no longer depended solely on Lovecraft's pen. Consider this carefully. By the mid-1930s, Lovecraft's circle, August Derleth, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, Frank Belknap Long, had already begun treating the Necronomicon as if it were an authentic mythic text. Derleth, in particular, championed an organized cosmology for the mythos, framing the book as central to a dualistic struggle between elder gods and great old ones. While Lovecraft rejected such theological clarity, the shift reveals something profound. The Necronomicon was no longer merely fictional. It had become a site of interpretive conflict. It is not just a book in the story. It is the battlefield of the easy story itself. In 1943, Derleth's story, The Lurker at the Threshold, credited jointly to himself and Lovecraft, elevated the Necronomicon to a tool of moral resistance. In it, the book is consulted to oppose cosmic evil, functioning as a guide to survival, rather than a lure toward madness. The implications are significant. This reinterpretation transforms the Necronomicon from a source of instability to a repository of arcane defense, a manual for the damned. It is not nihilism, but apocalyptic vigilance. Clark Ashton Smith, meanwhile, referenced the book with a tone closer to sardonic fatalism, using it to frame his darkly decadent tales in the fictional province of Auvergne. Robert Bloch, in The Shambler from the Stars, 1935, introduced the book as a fatal catalyst, while Fritz Leiber later expanded its presence through stories like The Terror from the Depths, 1976. Each iteration added not just layers, but angles, different curvatures of fear. The Necronomicon became a recursive entity, not a text with continuity, but a continuity that shifts with the teller. What do we call a book that writes itself through others? What happens when fictional continuity is more stable than belief? The Necronomicon mirrors sacred texts in this way. Like the Gnostic Gospels, it exists in fragments, in contradictions, in apocrypha. Like the Arthurian canon, it reshapes itself to reflect the values or terrors of each generation. And like Marvel's ever-expanding multiverse, it embraces contradiction as a feature, not a flaw. The repetition of 5 key terms, canon, text, expansion, fiction, continuity, reveals the engine of this transformation. The Necronomicon is never rewritten. It is always expanded. Its fictionality is what permits its permanence. Its canonicity lies not in being true within a universe, but in being present across universes. As Lovecraft's direct influence waned in the 1940s and 50s, the mythos grew not through central planning, but through infection. The Necronomicon became the viral core. We must pause again. In the 1970s and 1980s, as occult revivals gained popularity, the Necronomicon slipped further into ontological ambiguity. Edited versions emerged in real bookstores, some produced anonymously, others under pseudonyms. Authors like George Hay and Simon produced texts claiming direct derivation from Sumerian or Babylonian sources. While scholars rejected these as fabrications, the cultural shift was irreversible. The Necronomicon now existed in both fictional and non-fictional publishing categories, a paradox made flesh. In this way, the Necronomicon belongs to no author and no canon. It is not a linear text. It is not even a fixed idea. It is a procedural myth, a story generator, a self-mutating artifact that obeys the laws of narrative osmosis. And like all true myth, it survives not because it is finished, but because it never ends. The most unsettling aspect of the Necronomicon is not its content, but its refusal to remain fictional. Once introduced into the cultural bloodstream, it became what literary historian Harold Bloom might have called a misreading with power, an idea so resonant that readers insisted it must exist. This belief, or desire for belief, gave rise to an entire subculture of forged texts, published hoaxes, and self-declared translations, all attempting to turn Lovecraft's literary invention into an occult reality. One of the earliest and most influential of these was the so-called Hay Necronomicon, assembled in 1978 by editor George Hay and contributors including Colin Wilson. Purporting to be a recovered translation of an Arabic original by Abdul al-Hazred, the book uses fake scholarly apparatus, footnotes, linguistic claims, contextual allusions, to mimic academic rigor. Yet what it constructs is not knowledge, but the illusion of knowledge. It is not research, but performance. It is not academic truth, but narrative seduction wearing academic clothing. More notorious still is the Simon Necronomicon, first published in 1977. This version claims to translate a Babylonian source text, drawing on names and symbols from Sumerian and Akkadian myth. Its introduction presents a pseudo-historical timeline and quotes grimly from imaginary cults. Despite numerous scholarly rebuttals and internal inconsistencies, the Simon version remains widely read, perhaps precisely because of its contradictions. Consider this carefully. The very qualities that make it suspect to scholars make it compelling to believers. Authenticity in the world of occult texts is not measured by provenance alone. It is measured by effect. What, after all, constitutes a real forbidden book? Is it a matter of age, of paper and ink? Or is it belief, repetition, symbolic structure? The Necronomicon's imitators thrive because the boundary between fiction and forgery is itself porous. The Ower Linda book, a supposed Frisian chronicle discovered in 1867, or the Book of Soiga, an Elizabethan-ciphered grimoire connected to John Dee, show similar blurrings of line. They too operate not as texts, but as provocations. The reader becomes complicit in the act of meaning-making. To read is to participate in fabrication. The repetition of key terms, authenticity, forgery, occult, text, belief, exposes this cycle. The forgers do not merely copy Lovecraft's language, they replicate his method. They embed fictional citations, invent obscure authors, fabricate timelines. In doing so, they adopt not Lovecraft's horror, but his structure. And this raises a troubling question. If the Necronomicon is replicated in the same way real texts are, cited, translated, disputed, does its fictionality diminish, or does it evolve? We must pause here to note that even Lovecraft himself flirted with this ambiguity. He encouraged correspondents to reference the Necronomicon in their own works, and in letters he sometimes described it as, if it were real, at least in the sense that readers treated it as such. The result is a canon contaminated by play. Scholars now refer to Necronomica, a class of texts which exist only because people believe they might. It is not unlike religious apocrypha, where community belief sustains what institutional authority rejects. This reveals something profound. The Necronomicon hoaxes are not failed scholarship. They are inverted rituals. They are not merely lies, but offerings to a literary god whose power lies in being unverifiable. To read one is to participate in a strange rite. One foot in reality, one in story. It is not truth they seek, but continuity. And so, the cycle continues. Every forged edition, every online PDF, every self-published grimoire claiming secret lineage contributes not to confusion, but to expansion. The Necronomicon is not a stable object. It is a membrane that absorbs belief. It is not validated by fact. It is animated by recurrence. The Necronomicon was never just a literary device. It was always a symbol in waiting. As Lovecraft's stories passed from pulp pages to academic analysis, and then into mass media, the book became an icon of the forbidden, the arcane, the unspeakably influential. What began as a fictional artifact transformed into a cross-medium reference point, adapted, invoked, parodied, and worshipped in forms Lovecraft himself likely never anticipated. It is not merely cited, it is embedded. It is not just referenced, it is replicated. The most infamous cinematic invocation remains the Evil Dead franchise, 1981 present, where the Necronomicon Ex Mortis is a leathery, face-bound grimoire that unleashes demonic possession and time-warping horror. Director Sam Raimi's version plays with parody and pulp, but the symbol retains its core, a book so dangerous it alters time, identity, and causality. Notably, the Evil Dead's Necronomicon is not an adaptation of Lovecraft's book per se, but a mutation. It inherits the name and the idea of forbidden knowledge, while spinning a new mythos around flesh, ink, and voice. In John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, the Necronomicon appears not as a physical book, but as a metafictional concept, a story that causes madness, warps perception, and collapses the boundary between reader and world. This too is adaptation, not of content, but of effect. The book becomes a transmission vector for unreality. We must recognize that these adaptations function not to preserve the Necronomicon's contents, but to amplify its aura. Consider carefully, what other fictional book enjoys such persistent presence across media, while remaining unreadable by design? The Darkhold in Marvel's multiverse, the One Ring's inscription in Tolkien's lore, or even the Book of the Vishanti in Doctor Strange. Each plays a similar symbolic role. Yet only the Necronomicon straddles horror, science fiction, satire, and parody without losing its core dread. It is not simply adaptable, it is inexhaustible. This reveals something unexpected. The more the Necronomicon is reused, the more powerful it becomes, not in terms of content, but as a semiotic node. It is no longer just a book, it is a symbol of the book. It refers to itself, invokes its own mythology. From South Park to The Simpsons, from video games like Call of Cthulhu to card decks like Arkham Horror, the Necronomicon functions not as text, but as totem. And yet, one must ask, does this dilution also diminish its mystery? Does turning the forbidden into an action figure, a sticker, a t-shirt, hollow out the terror Lovecraft so carefully cultivated? The answer is not so simple. Because the Necronomicon was never real, it cannot be cheapened. It is not a text with an origin, it is a narrative virus. Adaptation does not harm it, it sustains it. We must pause here. What we call adaptation might be closer to possession. The symbol of the Necronomicon enters a story and takes root. It alters tone, expectation, implication. A brief visual reference in a horror film does not merely amuse, it reminds. It whispers of something larger, older, unsaid. This is the paradox. The more visible it becomes, the more it feeds the idea that its full truth remains hidden. Thus, the Necronomicon is not simply a plot device. It is a transmedia ghost. It drifts between genres, mediums, and decades, leaving behind not passages, but impressions. Its influence is not found in what it says, but in what it implies. The book is closed, the book is unreadable, and yet it speaks. If the Necronomicon has become a fixture in pop culture, it has truly found sanctuary in subculture, outside the glare of mainstream media, in basement tabletops, behind guitar feedback, and coded into alternate reality games. The book lives on, not as fiction, but as ritual. It is not simply referenced, it is enacted. It is not merely quoted, it is performed. These communities do not just study the book, they simulate its consequences. Nowhere is this more evident than in the evolution of tabletop gaming. Beginning with Call of Cthulhu, 1981, the Necronomicon was adapted into a game mechanic, both a source of forbidden lore and a destabilizing force. Reading from the book grants insights, spells, and power, but always at the cost of sanity. The dynamic mirrors Lovecraft's original theme. Knowledge without comprehension is corrosion. This mechanic has become a staple of horror RPGs, echoed in Arkham Horror, Eldritch Horror, and even Delta Green, where the Necronomicon is treated as both tool and trap. Yet the deeper integration happens in music. Particularly in doom, stoner, and black metal circles, the Necronomicon has passed into lyrical scripture. Bands like Electric Wizard, Necronomicon, Canada, and The Vision Bleak treat it not as metaphor, but as myth. Their lyrics reference Yog-Sothoth, summon Dagon, and invoke fragments of Lovecraft's arcane language. What matters is not theological belief, but aesthetic fidelity. The distortion, the obscurity, the invocation, all mirror the Necronomicon's effect, revelation through obliteration. Consider carefully. Why do these subcultures keep returning to the same false book? Why simulate a text that never existed? The answer is not historical, but symbolic. The Necronomicon offers what real-world texts cannot: mystery without meaning, coherence without resolution. It is not scripture, not prophecy, not satire. It is something rarer. It is a shared hallucination across media, culture, and time. This reveals a second paradox. In underground spaces, Reddit threads, ARG servers, hacker forums, the Necronomicon circulates as a digital relic. Sometimes it's repurposed as SCP's XXXX in the SCP Foundation. Sometimes it's buried in Easter eggs across horror mods and creepypasta. But it always performs the same symbolic function. It hints. It does not explain. Like Discordianism's Principia Discordia or the Codex Seraphinianus, it invites decoding while ensuring none is possible. And this is where the Necronomicon thrives. In sanctioned narratives, it is a risk. But in subcultures, it is a right. To reference the book is to signal allegiance to the unknowable. In ARGs like The Sun Vanished, cryptic grimoires draw from its aesthetics. In black metal zines, to cite, it is to invoke transgression. In fan-made films, it becomes a prop through which reality is temporarily rewritten. We must recognize that this usage is not parody, nor is it belief. It is ritual. These communities understand the fictionality of the Necronomicon, but they also understand that its power lies not in truth, but in tradition. To find the book is to join a lineage. To quote, it is to speak in the voice of something that was never human. It is not merely role play. It is rehearsal for a cosmic drama no one can fully explain. Is this devotion, or simply a form of artistic recursion? The line is thin. When a symbol endures this long across this many platforms, one must ask whether we are still referencing it, or whether it is referencing us. Thus, the Necronomicon does not survive on shelves or in libraries. It survives in distortion pedals, in haunted rulebooks, in anonymous threads. It belongs not to Lovecraft anymore, but to the collective imagination of those drawn to what cannot be resolved. Even after the pop culture trends fade, after the game mechanics become outdated and the subcultures evolve, the Necronomicon persists, not merely as a literary invention, but as a recurring psychological symbol. This endurance demands explanation. It is not a matter of nostalgia nor of fandom. It is a philosophical echo. The Necronomicon survives not because it reveals the truth, but because it perfectly embodies the impossibility of truth. In a world desperate for coherence, the book offers only recursion, and therein lies its power. Consider this carefully. The Necronomicon does not ask to be believed. It demands to be considered. It is not like the Bible, which asserts doctrine, nor like the Book of the Law, which commands obedience. It is more akin to Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason or Heidegger's Being and Time, texts so dense, so conceptually disorienting, that the act of reading itself becomes a confrontation with the limits of understanding. But unlike Kant or Heidegger, the Necronomicon offers no systematization, no conclusion. It exists purely as a symbol of the unknown, not as a roadmap through it. Psychologically, it externalizes the fear of incomprehensibility. Carl Jung wrote of the shadow, the part of the psyche that resists integration. The Necronomicon is shadow given form, not evil but unassimilated, not madness but the mirror that reflects it. In this way, the book functions less like a grimoire and more like a psychological test. What you project into it, you must confront. The Necronomicon, as countless fictional accounts suggest, doesn't curse the reader. It uncovers what was already unstable. We must recognize this literary device as a philosophical challenge. The book reveals nothing. And that very void, its lack of fixed meaning, is what ensures its longevity. In this sense, it belongs to a lineage of texts designed not to inform, but to destabilize. Like Borges's Library of Babel, or even Derrida's notion of difference, the Necronomicon destabilizes meaning by suggesting infinite context without resolution. Every interpretation generates further ambiguity. Every certainty dissolves into myth. And so, the reader is left not with knowledge, but with vertigo. This is not accidental. It is a design of genius. For in the Necronomicon, Lovecraft created not just a fictional book, but a thought form, a mimetic structure that infects other stories, other minds. It does not require belief to operate. It requires only acknowledgement, a whispered name, a casual reference, a copy bought ironically. That is enough. It spreads through implication. Is the book cursed? No. That would make it manageable. The truth is far worse. It is conceptually viral. Not demonic, not divine, but symbolic. Once known, it cannot be forgotten. Once named, it waits. In academic terms, it functions like a philosophical paradox. Gödel's incompleteness theorem for the soul. You can explore it forever. You will never find its edge. And here we return to its most disquieting implication. The Necronomicon is not real in the material sense, but neither are many things that move us. Justice, God, the self. Its endurance proves that cultural power lies not in fact, but in function. The book functions as a black hole of meaning, drawing thought toward it, collapsing certainty, leaving only gravity and darkness. This is why it endures in dreams, in writings, in art, in moments of uncanny dread. When the rational mind fails, when categories collapse, the Necronomicon appears, not as a solution, but as a signpost. Not to a place, but to an absence. It is not the answer, it is the shape of the question. And so, we end where we began. The Necronomicon is not a grimoire, not a hoax, not a footnote in horror fiction. It is a symbol of what we cannot explain, but cannot stop imagining. It lives because it refuses to close. It speaks because it cannot be heard. And we continue reading, because some truths once glimpsed mark us forever.